Leonidas, the lion who defied an empire, the blood of kings. Dawn breaks cold over Thermopylae. The sky bleeds crimson and gold, painting the narrow pass between mountain and sea in shades of fire. A man stands at the edge of everything he has ever known. His name is Leonidas. Behind him, 300 warriors ready themselves for death. Before him, an army vast enough to darken the horizon waits to devour Greece whole. But this moment, this final threshold between life and legend, was forged long before dawn touched these cliffs. It was forged in childhood pain, in adolescent hunger, in the iron discipline of a city that knew only one truth: Sparta does not surrender. To understand how a king came to stand here, choosing death over retreat, we must go back to when he was not a king at all, but a third son with no future and no throne. Back to 540 BC, when the world was different, but Sparta was eternal. The city of Sparta lay in the valley of Laconia, cradled by mountains and watered by the Eurotas River. It was a place of contradictions, brutal yet cultured, isolated yet feared across the known world. While Athens built theaters and debated philosophy in marble forums, Sparta built soldiers. While other Greek city-states raised walls to protect their citizens, Sparta pointed to its warriors and said, "These are our walls." Into this world, Leonidas was born. His father was King Anaxandridas II, a ruler of the Agoge dynasty, one of two royal bloodlines that claimed descent from the great hero Heracles himself. But Leonidas's birth was tangled in scandal and desperation, shadowed by the same politics that would shape his entire life. The story begins with barrenness. Anaxandridas' first wife, a woman whose name history has swallowed whole, could not bear children. Year after year passed in silence. No heir emerged from the royal bedchamber. The ephors, 5 annually elected magistrates who wielded immense power in Sparta's unique dual monarchy system, grew impatient. They approached the king with a demand that would have been unthinkable in any other Greek city. "Set aside your wife and take another who can give you sons." Anaxandridas refused. His wife was blameless, he insisted. She had committed no crime. Why should she suffer exile for what the gods had decreed? The ephors, pragmatic men in a pragmatic city, found a compromise. "Keep your first wife," they said, "but take a second as well. Let both women dwell in your household. Surely one of them will bear you an heir." So Anaxandridas took a second wife, a woman descended from Cylon, one of the 7 sages of Greece. And quickly, almost mockingly quickly, she conceived. A son was born and named Cleomenes. The succession was secure. The ephors were satisfied. But fate, it seemed, had a sense of irony. Within a year of Cleomenes' birth, the first wife also became pregnant. She bore a son named Dorieus. Then came Leonidas. And finally, Cleombrotus, though some ancient sources suggest Leonidas and Cleombrotus might have been twins. History is unclear on this small detail, as it is unclear about so much regarding men who were not first in line for power. The name Leonidas means son of the lion, or like a lion. It was a name given by his grandfather Leon, and it would prove prophetic. But in childhood, prophecy means nothing. In childhood, reality is simple. Cleomenes was the eldest son of the second wife, and by Spartan law, he was the heir. Dorieus was the eldest son of the first wife, and he burned with resentment at being passed over. Leonidas was third in line. So far from the throne it might as well have been on another world. This changed everything. In Sparta, the firstborn sons of the 2 royal families were exempt from the agoge, the brutal state education system that transformed boys into soldiers. They were groomed for kingship, taught politics and strategy, and the art of command in the comfort of the royal household. But Leonidas was not firstborn. Leonidas would not be king. So at age 7, like every other Spartan boy, he was torn from his mother's arms and marched to the barracks. He would be forged in the same fire that created every Spartan warrior. He would learn what it meant to bleed, to starve, to endure, and to never, ever break. The irony would only become clear decades later, when the throne came to him anyway, not through birthright, but through tragedy, exile, and mysterious death. When Leonidas finally became king, he was not a prince who played at war. He was a warrior who happened to wear a crown, and that made all the difference. Forged in iron. The morning Leonidas entered the agoge, he ceased to be a child. 7 years old, small and vulnerable, he stood in a line with dozens of other boys. Some cried. Those who cried too loudly were beaten until they learned silence. Some tried to run. Those who ran were dragged back and made examples of. Most simply stood, eyes forward, trying to understand what their lives had suddenly become. The man in charge was called the paidonomos, literally, the herder of boys. He was not gentle. He was not kind. He did not see children when he looked at this line of small bodies. He saw raw material. He saw potential soldiers who would either become worthy of Sparta or die trying. The agoge was not merely military training. It was a systematic dismantling of individual identity, and its reconstruction as something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Modern scholars compare it to indoctrination. Ancient Greeks simply called it necessary. The goal was singular. Create men who would never retreat, never surrender, never value their own lives above the state. From age 7 to 12, the boys lived in packs. They slept in communal barracks on beds of reeds they gathered themselves from the riverbanks. No blankets were provided, even in the bitter Laconian winter when snow dusted the mountains and the night air cut like bronze. The boys learned to huddle together for warmth, their small bodies pressed close in the dark. They learned that survival meant cooperation, that weakness in one could endanger all. Food was scarce by design. The boys were given just enough to keep them alive, never enough to satisfy. Hunger became their constant companion. They were expected to steal food from the surrounding countryside, from the helots who worked Sparta's fields, even from the citizens' homes. But if caught, they were flogged without mercy. The lesson was not that stealing was wrong. The lesson was that getting caught was unforgivable. One famous annual ritual embodied this principle. Young boys were sent to steal cheese from the altar of Artemis or Thea, guarded by older youths with whips. The goal was not just to take the cheese, but to endure the whipping without crying out. Historians record that some boys died from the lashes they received. Their deaths were considered honorable. They had proven themselves capable of enduring pain unto death, the highest Spartan virtue. Physical training was relentless. Running, wrestling, boxing, javelin throwing, discus hurling. The boys' lean bodies grew hard as the wooden spears they thrust at targets hour after hour. They learned to fight in formation, moving as one organism rather than as individuals. The phalanx, that legendary Spartan battle formation of overlapping shields and bristling spears, was not just a tactic. It was a philosophy inscribed in muscle memory and scar tissue. At age 12, the training intensified. The boys were given one red cloak each year and nothing else. They wore it in summer heat and winter cold. They walked barefoot across rocky ground until their soles turned to leather. They learned to ignore discomfort, then pain, then agony. They learned that the body was merely a tool, and like any tool, it could be broken in service to a greater purpose. They were taught to read and write, but only enough to serve their turn. Mathematics, philosophy, history. These were studied briefly and superficially. The true curriculum was warfare. Every lesson, every exercise, every moment was designed to prepare them for the day they would stand in a battle line, with their shields locked together, facing an enemy that wanted them dead. But the agoge taught more than violence. It taught cunning. Boys were sent into the countryside with no food and ordered to survive for days. They learned to move silently, to steal without detection, to kill without hesitation. Some sources claim they were ordered to murder helots as practice, though modern historians debate this. What is certain is that they learned to see other human beings as obstacles to be overcome, rather than as people deserving empathy. They learned the economy of words. Sparta was famous for its laconic speech, short, sharp, devoid of unnecessary elaboration. When an Athenian diplomat once said, "If we invade Laconia, we will destroy your farms and burn your city," a Spartan, Ephoret, replied simply, "If." This was the verbal style the boys absorbed. Every word counted. Verbosity was weakness. At age 15, the boys became paidiskoi, transitioning from childhood toward adulthood. They were paired with older mentors called erastes, adult Spartan citizens who guided their development. In other Greek city-states, these relationships were often sexual. In Sparta, the emphasis was on martial mentorship and social integration, though the exact nature of these bonds remains debated by historians. What matters is that the boys learned to see themselves not as individuals, but as links in an unbroken chain stretching back to Heracles and forward into eternity. At 20, those who survived became irenes, full warriors eligible for the army. But even then, the education continued. They could not marry until age 30. They lived in military barracks, ate in communal mess halls called syssitia, and spent every day training for war. The modern concept of youth or adolescence did not exist in Sparta. There were only boys learning to be warriors, and men who were warriors. Nothing else mattered. For Leonidas, the agoge was both crucible and gift. As a royal son, he could have been sheltered. Instead, he endured every hardship his fellow Spartans faced. He learned hunger. He learned pain. He learned that survival requires will more than strength, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear dictate action. And somewhere in those brutal years, a boy named after a lion became a man worthy of the name. Years later, when someone said to him, "Except for being king, you are not at all superior to us," Leonidas replied, "But were I not better than you, I should not be king." He was not referring to his royal blood. He was referring to everything he had endured and overcome in the agoge. He had proven himself in the only way Spartans recognized, through suffering made meaningful. This was not a prince playing soldier. This was a soldier who happened to be a prince. And when the time came to stand at Thermopylae, that distinction would mean everything. The unlikely king. The path to the throne was paved with corpses and bad decisions. For most of his life, Leonidas never expected to wear the crown. He was a warrior, a citizen, a man who had earned his place in Spartan society through blood and discipline. The throne belonged to his half-brother Cleomenes, and then perhaps to Dorieus, who was older and fiercely ambitious. Leonidas was simply the spare, the insurance policy, the forgotten prince who trained like every other Spartan, and probably preferred it that way. King Anaxandridas II died around 524 BC. Cleomenes ascended to power sometime between then and 516 BC, becoming one of Sparta's two kings. He was brilliant and erratic in equal measure, a man capable of remarkable military achievements and equally remarkable cruelty. Dorieus, the proud eldest son of the first wife, could not stomach living under his half-brother's rule. He departed Sparta to seek his fortune elsewhere, first attempting to establish a colony in North Africa, then moving to Sicily when that venture failed. He found initial success there, carving out territory through force of arms. But his ambitions ended abruptly. He was killed in Sicily, his dreams of founding a new Spartan colony dying with him on foreign soil. With Dorieus gone, Leonidas remained in Sparta, quietly serving as a citizen soldier. He participated in the Battle of Sparta against Argos, around 494 BC, already designated as Cleomenes' heir, since the king had produced no male children. He witnessed the continuing tensions with Persia, when envoys came in 492 or 491 BC, demanding earth and water as symbols of submission. The Spartans threw the Persian heralds into a well, telling them to gather earth and water from there. Athens threw their heralds into a pit. The message was clear: Greece would not kneel. Somewhere in this period, probably before 490 BC, Leonidas married Gorgo. She was Cleomenes' daughter, his niece, and by all accounts an extraordinary woman. In a society that produced physically powerful women trained in gymnastics and athletics, Gorgo stood out not for her physique, but for her mind. Herodotus, who rarely bothered to name Greek women in his histories, mentioned her repeatedly, always with respect. One famous anecdote tells of Gorgo as a girl of 8 or 9, watching her father negotiate with Aristagoras of Miletus. The Milesian tried to bribe Cleomenes to support the Ionian revolt against Persia, offering increasingly large sums. Gorgo saw her father wavering and said simply, "Father, get up and go, or the stranger will certainly corrupt you." Cleomenes listened. The bribe was refused, and the disastrous Ionian revolt proceeded without Spartan support, eventually collapsing in bloody failure. The 8-year-old girl had seen what grown men missed. Years later, when a seemingly blank wax tablet arrived from Demaratus, the exiled former Spartan king now at the Persian court, no one could decipher it. They saw only wax and assumed it was empty. Gorgo suggested they scrape the wax away. Beneath it, carved into the wood, was Demaratus's warning. Xerxes is coming. The massive Persian invasion was imminent. Gorgo's intelligence may have given Sparta the time it needed to prepare. She was, in essence, one of history's first recorded female cryptanalysts, and she was Leonidas's wife. The marriage was more than political alliance, though it was certainly that. It seems to have been a partnership of equals, rare in the ancient world. When an Athenian woman once asked Gorgo why Spartan women were the only ones who could rule men, Gorgo replied, "Because we are the only ones who give birth to real men." The line was cutting, arrogant, and quintessentially Spartan. It suggested a relationship between Leonidas and Gorgo built on mutual respect, rather than subordination. They had at least one son, Pleistarchus, though there may have been other children who died young, or were daughters unrecorded by history. Pleistarchus was still young when Leonidas marched to Thermopylae, suggesting the marriage had continued to produce heirs even after Leonidas took the throne. But first, the throne had to become available, and for that, Cleomenes had to die. Cleomenes' reign was marked by brilliance and paranoia. He successfully organized Greek resistance against the first Persian invasion in 490 BC, though he did not participate directly because of religious festivals that forbade the Spartan army from marching. Athens won the Battle of Marathon without significant Spartan help, a fact that must have rankled Cleomenes deeply. His later years were troubled. He meddled in Athenian politics. He fought a brutal war against Argos, burning a sacred grove and slaughtering prisoners who had surrendered. He bribed the Delphic oracle to secure the deposition of his co-king Demaratus, who then fled to Persia and became an advisor to the great king. Then, around 490 BC, Cleomenes went mad. Or perhaps he was murdered, and madness was the convenient explanation. The sources disagree. What we know is that Cleomenes began attacking random citizens in the streets with his staff. His family had him imprisoned in the stocks. There, according to Herodotus, he convinced a Helot slave to give him a knife. He then began mutilating himself, cutting strips of flesh from his legs, thighs, hips and sides, working his way up his body until he reached his belly and finally died in agony. The death was horrific, suspicious, and convenient. With Cleomenes gone and no male heir, Leonidas became king around 490 BC. He was roughly 50 years old, an age when most Spartans were winding down their military service. Instead, his most crucial service was just beginning. Leonidas ruled jointly with King Leotychidas of the Eurypontid dynasty, Sparta's other royal family. The dual kingship was designed to prevent tyranny, to provide checks and balances. In peacetime, the kings had limited power, subordinate to the ephors and the gerousia, the council of elders. But in war, the kings commanded absolutely, and war was coming. The decade of Leonidas's reign was consumed by a single, overwhelming reality: Persia. The Battle of Marathon in 490 BC had humiliated King Darius of Persia. His son Xerxes, who ascended the Persian throne in 486 BC after Darius's death, inherited both an empire and a grudge. Xerxes was not content to let Marathon stand as the final word. He spent 4 years assembling the largest military force the ancient world had ever seen. He dug a canal through Mount Athos to avoid the storms that had destroyed a previous Persian fleet. He built pontoon bridges across the Hellespont, linking Asia to Europe. He stockpiled supplies at depots along the invasion route, and in the spring of 480 BC, he began the march westward. Leonidas understood what was coming. He spent his reign preparing for it, traveling to other Greek city-states, forging alliances, building the coalition that would resist the invasion. Athens was building a massive fleet under Themistocles' guidance, using newfound silver wealth from the mines at Laurium. Sparta provided the land forces and the command structure. When the Greek city-states met at Corinth in 481 BC to form the Hellenic League, Leonidas was chosen to lead the combined Greek land forces. It was a tribute to his reputation, his experience, and perhaps to the simple fact that everyone knew Spartans did not run from fights. But before marching out to meet Xerxes, Leonidas consulted the oracle at Delphi. The priestess spoke in hexameter verse, and her words were chilling. "For you, inhabitants of wide-wayed Sparta, either your great and glorious city must be wasted by Persian men, or, if not that, then the bound of Lacedaemon must mourn a dead king from Heracles' line. The might of bulls or lions will not restrain him with opposing strength, for he has the might of Zeus. I declare that he will not be restrained until he utterly tears apart one of these." The prophecy offered a terrible choice: Sparta's destruction or a king's death. Leonidas, descendant of Heracles, understood immediately. He could save Sparta by dying. And so he made his choice before ever reaching Thermopylae. He selected 300 men, each chosen personally, each required to have living sons who could carry on their bloodlines. He was taking married men with heirs, because he was taking men who would not return. When he marched north in August 480 BC, Leonidas went to fulfill the oracle's prophecy. He went to die. But first, he would show Xerxes and the world what 300 Spartans could do. The shadow from the east. The invasion that descended upon Greece in 480 BC was not merely an army. It was a tidal wave of humanity, drawn from every corner of the vast Persian Empire, from Egypt to India, from the steppes of Central Asia to the shores of the Mediterranean. Xerxes gathered his forces. The great king intended to crush Greece not just militarily but psychologically, to demonstrate that resistance was futile against the might of Persia. Herodotus, writing a generation later, claimed Xerxes commanded over 5 million men. Modern historians dismiss this as absurd exaggeration. The logistical impossibility of moving, feeding, and watering 5 million people across ancient terrain defies credibility. Yet even conservative estimates place the Persian army at somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 soldiers, accompanied by a fleet of 600 to 1,000 warships. By any measure, it was the largest military force ever assembled in the ancient Mediterranean world. The composition of this army reflected the empire's diversity. There were Persian cavalry, mounted on powerful horses and armed with composite bows that could pierce armor at distance. There were the immortals, the elite 10,000-man royal guard, so named because their ranks were immediately replenished whenever a man fell, ensuring the unit's strength never diminished. There were Median infantry, Elamite archers, Egyptian marines, Indian warriors, Thracian peltasts, Ethiopian spearmen, Phrygian slingers, and contingents from dozens of other subject peoples. Some fought willingly for imperial glory. Others fought because refusal meant death or enslavement for their families. The Persian military machine was sophisticated. They understood combined arms tactics, using cavalry to harass and disrupt while infantry advanced. Their archers could darken the sky with arrows, creating killing zones that infantry could exploit. They had siege engineers capable of reducing fortified cities, and naval specialists skilled at amphibious operations. This was not a mob. This was a professional military force backed by the wealth and resources of the richest empire on earth. Xerxes himself was 38 years old, born to power and educated in the arts of war and governance. He was not a fool. He had crushed revolts in Egypt and Babylon before turning his attention westward. He understood that Greece was fragmented, that most city-states would submit rather than risk annihilation. His strategy was as much diplomatic as military. Isolate Athens and Sparta by securing the submission of everyone else. He sent heralds throughout Greece demanding earth and water, the traditional symbols of submission. Many states complied. Thessaly, a powerful region in northern Greece, submitted almost immediately when they saw the size of the approaching army. Thebes, a major city in Boeotia, wavered and eventually Medized, collaborated with the Persians. Other cities saw the Persian army drink rivers dry, saw its campfires spread across the horizon like a constellation of malevolent stars, and chose survival over honor. But not Athens, not Sparta, not the Hellenic League that formed to resist. At Corinth in 481 BC, representatives from about 30 Greek city-states met to coordinate their defense. This was unprecedented. Greeks famously spent more time fighting each other than cooperating. City-state rivalries ran deep, old grudges festering like infected wounds. Athens and Sparta, the two most powerful states, had different political systems, different cultures, different gods they honored above others. Athens was democratic, commercial, intellectual. Sparta was oligarchic, militaristic, austere. They had little in common, except the certainty that Persian domination would end Greek independence forever. Sparta would command the land forces. Athens would command the fleet, or at least contribute the majority of ships. Themistocles, the brilliant Athenian politician and strategist, understood that the war would be won or lost at sea. He had convinced the Athenians to use silver from the Laurium mines to build a fleet of 200 triremes, fast warships with bronze rams capable of puncturing enemy hulls. The Greek fleet would harass Persian supply lines, contest control of the Aegean, and hopefully prevent the Persian navy from simply sailing around any land defense and landing troops behind Greek lines. But the land defense still mattered. Even with a powerful fleet, Greece needed time. Time to evacuate Athens if necessary, time for internal politics to align, time for stragglers to join the coalition, and time was exactly what Leonidas could provide at Thermopylae. The pass at Thermopylae, the hot gates, named for the sulphurous hot springs that bubbled up from the ground, was a narrow coastal corridor between the mountains of central Greece and the Malian Gulf. At its narrowest point, it was perhaps 15 to 20 meters wide, barely enough space for a dozen men to stand shoulder to shoulder. The southern side was bounded by steep cliffs. The northern side dropped into the sea. An army attacking through Thermopylae could not use its numbers. It had to funnel into the narrow gap where Greek hoplites, heavily armored and fighting in tight formation, would have every advantage. It was perfect defensive terrain. It was also vulnerable to being bypassed. Local shepherds knew of a mountain trail, the Anapeia path, that wound through the heights south of the pass and emerged behind any force defending the gates. Leonidas knew about this path. He stationed 1,000 Phocian soldiers on the heights to guard it. As long as the mountain route was blocked, Thermopylae was impregnable. In August 480 BC, Leonidas marched north with his 300 Spartans. Along the way, he was joined by contingents from other cities. 500 from Tegea, 500 from Mantinea, 120 from Orchomenus, 1,000 from the rest of Arcadia, 400 from Corinth, 200 from Phlius, 80 from Mycenae. From Boeotia came 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans. In total, somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 Greek hoplites assembled at Thermopylae to face an army 50 to 100 times their size. The Spartans were easy to identify. They wore crimson cloaks, the color chosen to hide bloodstains, and grew their hair long. Before battle, they would comb it carefully, making themselves beautiful for death. This was psychological warfare as much as vanity. It said, "We are not afraid. We are not desperate. We are grooming ourselves for our funeral because we have already accepted what is coming." When the Persian army arrived, Xerxes sent scouts to observe the Greek position. The scouts reported something bizarre. The Spartans were exercising and combing their hair. Xerxes summoned Demaratus, the exiled Spartan king who now served as his advisor, and asked what this meant. Were these men mad? Did they not understand they were about to die? Demaratus, who understood his former countrymen better than any Persian ever could, explained, "These men have come to fight us for the pass, and they are making ready to do so. This is their custom. When they are about to risk their lives, they groom their hair." He added that if Xerxes could conquer these men and the rest of Sparta, there was no nation on earth that would dare resist him. But conquering them would not be easy. Xerxes did not believe him. How could a few thousand men stand against hundreds of thousands? It was madness. It was suicide. And so the great king waited, certain that the Greeks would retreat once they saw the full extent of the force arrayed against them. He waited 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days. The Greeks did not move. They reinforced an old defensive wall at the narrowest part of the pass and prepared to fight. On the 5th day, his patience exhausted, Xerxes gave the order to attack. The Battle of Thermopylae had begun, and for 3 days the impossible happened. The Persians broke themselves against a wall of bronze and iron and refused to break through. The Greeks taught Xerxes a lesson that would echo through history. Courage and position can defeat raw numbers. For a while, for 3 precious days that bought Greece the time it desperately needed. The hot gates. The morning of the first attack, the Spartans stood calm. Around them, the allied Greeks shifted nervously, checked their equipment, muttered prayers to gods who seemed very far away. But the Spartans were silent, their long hair combed and oiled, their crimson cloaks bright against the grey stone of the pass. They had been born for this moment. 20, 30, 40 years of training had prepared them for exactly this, to stand in a line with their brothers, shields locked together, and hold ground against an enemy that wanted them dead. Leonidas walked along the line, speaking quietly to his men. He did not give rousing speeches. Spartans had no use for rhetoric. He simply checked their readiness, looked each man in the eye, and moved on. Every warrior there understood what was at stake. Behind them lay Greece, their wives, their children, their homeland. Before them lay Persia, an empire that had devoured nations, that had enslaved millions, that now demanded Greece bend the knee. The pass at Thermopylae was not just a defensive position. It was the threshold between freedom and slavery, between Greek independence and Persian domination. And these men, outnumbered but unbroken, had chosen to be the door that would not open. The Persian attack began with arrows, thousands of them, blotting out the sun as they arced over the pass and fell like lethal rain. The Greeks raised their shields, forming a roof of bronze overhead, and endured. Arrows clattered off metal, thudded into wooden shield rims, sometimes found gaps in armor and drew blood. Men stumbled and fell. The line closed up, shields pressing tighter together, leaving no space for death to slip through. Then came the infantry. The first waves were Medes and Elamites, subject peoples fighting for an empire that had conquered them, came in dense masses. Brave men facing what must have seemed like certain death. They carried shorter spears than the Greeks, lighter shields, less armor. When they met the Greek phalanx, they met a hedge of bronze-tipped spears, 8 feet long, wielded by men who had trained their entire lives to kill efficiently. The killing was methodical. The Greeks fought in rotation, fresh men moving to the front as others stepped back to rest. The phalanx was not just a formation, it was a killing machine that could sustain itself for hours. The front-rank Spartans thrust their spears over the tops of their shields, aiming for throats and faces. Behind them, second-rank warriors stabbed through the gaps, their longer spears reaching past their comrades to impale attackers trying to push forward. The Persians died by the dozens, then by the hundreds. Their bodies piled up in the narrow pass, creating obstacles that the next wave had to climb over. Xerxes watched from his golden throne on a hillside overlooking the pass. Herodotus tells us he leapt from his seat 3 times in dismay, as he watched his forces repelled again and again. The Greeks were not just defeating his army, they were humiliating it. The narrow pass negated the Persian advantage in numbers. Only a few dozen men could fight at the front at any given time, and in that space, the heavily armored, superbly trained Greek hoplites were simply superior. The first day's attacks failed entirely. The Persians withdrew, dragging their dead from the pass, trying to comprehend what had just happened. They had lost thousands of men against an enemy that numbered in the low thousands. The math did not add up. The great king's anger burned cold and bright. On the second day, Xerxes sent in the immortals, his elite royal guard. These were the best soldiers in the Persian Empire, chosen for their skill and loyalty, equipped with the finest armor and weapons Persia could provide. They were called immortals because their unit was always 10,000 strong. When a man fell, another immediately replaced him, ensuring the unit never diminished. They were the hammer Xerxes used to break resistance. They had never failed before. They failed at Thermopylae. The immortals discovered what the Medes and Elamites had learned the previous day. In the narrow pass, numbers meant nothing. The Greeks could not be flanked, could not be surrounded, could not be overwhelmed by mass. The immortals crashed against the phalanx like waves against a cliff. Individual Persian warriors were brave, skilled, dangerous. But Greek tactics and Greek armor made individual skill nearly irrelevant. The phalanx was a collective organism, each man protecting his neighbor, each shield overlapping the next. Break the line and you could win, but breaking the line required either superior force or inferior courage in the defenders. The Persians had superior force but could not bring it to bear, and the Greeks had courage in abundance. Herodotus describes a tactic the Spartans employed. They would pretend to break and run, turning their backs to the enemy. The Persians, seeing victory, would charge forward in disorder, abandoning their formations to pursue. Then the Spartans would whirl around, reform their phalanx, and slaughter the disorganized pursuers. This feigned retreat and sudden reversal happened multiple times, luring the Persians into death traps they could not escape. It required not just discipline, but absolute trust in one's brothers. Any real hesitation, any moment of genuine fear, and the tactic would collapse into actual rout. But Spartans did not rout. It was not in their nature. The fighting was brutal and exhausting. Imagine the physical toll. Hours of standing in heavy bronze armor in the August sun, the weight of the helmet pressing down on your skull, the reek of blood and sweat and voided bowels from dying men. Imagine the constant need to stay alert, to parry spear thrusts aimed at your throat, to push against the pressure of enemies trying to drive you backward. Imagine watching men you had trained with since childhood fall with Persian arrows in their throats or spears in their guts. And then imagine doing it again the next day. And the next. By the end of the second day, the Persians had suffered staggering casualties. Estimates range from 10,000 to 20,000 dead. The Greeks had lost perhaps a few hundred. The math was impossible, but it was happening. The Greeks were holding. Thermopylae was becoming a symbol of something the Persians had not anticipated. That free men fighting for their homes were worth 10 slaves fighting for an emperor's glory. Xerxes faced a dilemma. He could not retreat. That would be humiliating, would encourage rebellion in his empire, would make him look weak. He could not force the pass. 2 days of frontal assaults had proven that was suicide. He could not go around by sea. The Greek fleet was contesting control of the straits at Artemisium, preventing amphibious landings. He was trapped by geography and Greek courage. And then, on the evening of the second day, a man approached the Persian camp. His name was Ephialtes, and he brought Xerxes the key to victory. There was a path through the mountains. For the promise of reward, this Greek traitor would show the Persians how to get behind Leonidas's position. He would hand them Greece. The Anapia path wound through the mountains south of Thermopylae, emerging behind the Greek position at the eastern end of the pass. It was not a secret. Leonidas knew about it. He had stationed 1,000 Phocian soldiers on the heights specifically to guard it. But Ephialtes knew the terrain intimately, and he promised Hydarnes, commander of the immortals, that he could guide them through in a single night. In the darkness, 10,000 immortals left the Persian camp and began climbing. They moved in silence, their sandaled feet soft on the rocky ground, their weapons muffled. Through the mountains they went, following Ephialtes through paths that wound between cliffs and ravines. All night they marched, trusting a traitor to lead them truly. Just before dawn, the immortals reached the top of the pass. The Phocian guards positioned to watch the path were alerted by the sound of leaves rustling as thousands of feet moved through the forest. They scrambled to arm themselves, shocked that the Persians had found the path, terrified at the number of enemy soldiers emerging from the pre-dawn gloom. Hydarnes saw them and asked Ephialtes who they were. Ephialtes assured him they were not Spartans, just Phocians. The immortals loosed a volley of arrows at the Phocians, who retreated to higher ground and prepared to die. But the Persians did not pursue. They had no interest in a side battle. They bypassed the Phocians and continued down the eastern slope toward the Greek rear. A runner reached Leonidas just before dawn with the news. The Phocians had not held. The Persians were coming. The Greeks were surrounded. Leonidas called a council of war as the sun rose on the third day. The situation was clear. They were trapped between the Persian army at the western end of the pass and the immortals descending from the eastern heights. Escape was still possible, barely, but only if they moved immediately. Stay, and they would all die. According to Herodotus, many Greeks argued for retreat. Better to regroup, to fight another day, to not waste thousands of lives in a doomed last stand. Leonidas listened. Then he made his decision. He ordered the bulk of the allied forces to withdraw. They had done their duty. They had held for 2 days and inflicted terrible casualties on the Persians. Now they should live to fight again, at Plataea, at Salamis, wherever Greece would make its next stand. But Leonidas would not retreat. The 300 Spartans would stay. So would the 700 Thespians, who refused to abandon the Spartans and chose death with honor. The 400 Thebans remained as well, though sources disagree whether they stayed willingly or were held as hostages. And the Helots, the enslaved population that accompanied every Spartan army, to serve as attendants and laborers. Many of them stayed too, taking up arms and preparing to die alongside the citizens. Some historians believe Leonidas dismissed the allies to save them. Others believe he kept the Spartans and Thespians to maximize the time the retreating Greeks would have to escape. Still others think Leonidas remembered the oracle's prophecy and understood that only a king's death would fulfill it, would save Sparta from destruction. Perhaps all these motivations intertwined. What is certain is that Leonidas chose death. And in doing so, he transformed a tactical defeat into a moral victory that would inspire Greece for generations. As the bulk of the Greek army marched away south, heading towards safety, Leonidas and his remaining forces prepared for the end. Had hours at most before the immortals completed their descent. Hours to make their final preparations, to say goodbye to life, to ready themselves for the last gift a Spartan could give his city, a beautiful death in service to Sparta. Until the last breath. The dawn of the third day broke red and gold over Thermopylae. The sun rose over the Malian Gulf, painting the water in shades of blood and fire. Leonidas stood at the eastern end of the pass, where the defensive wall met the cliffs, and looked at the men who had chosen to die with him. 300 Spartans, their crimson cloaks bright against the grey stone. 700 Thespians, who could have fled but refused. 400 Thebans, whose loyalty was questionable but whose presence was recorded. And Helots, uncounted in the sources but present nonetheless, having decided that freedom meant nothing without honor. The math was brutal. Perhaps 1,400 men, counting the Helots. Behind them to the east, 10,000 immortals were descending from the mountain path, cutting off any retreat. Before them to the west, the Persian army that had suffered terrible casualties, but still numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The Greeks were surrounded, outnumbered 100 to 1, facing certain death, and yet they did not run. They prepared for battle with the same care they had shown every other morning of the campaign. Leonidas knew the Persians would attack from both directions simultaneously, crushing the Greeks between two forces. The defensive wall would no longer protect them. They would be fighting in the open, unable to use the narrow terrain that had given them such advantage. But Leonidas had one last card to play. He ordered his men to advance. They left the protection of the wall and marched westward into the wider part of the pass. This shocked the Persians, who expected the Greeks to cower behind their fortifications. Instead, here came the Spartans, shields locked, spears leveled, advancing to meet death on their own terms. It was psychological warfare at its finest. These men were so unafraid, so contemptuous of death, that they would charge toward it rather than wait for it to arrive. The Persians came at them in waves. With more room to deploy, the great king could bring vastly more men to bear. Persian archers poured arrows into the Greek formation. Persian cavalry tried to circle and strike from the flanks. Persian infantry, emboldened by their numbers, pressed forward, eager to finally crush this stubborn resistance. And still the Greeks held. The phalanx contracted, tightened, became a circle of shields with spears bristling outward like a hedgehog. Every side was the front. Every direction brought enemies. But every direction also brought death to those enemies, because Spartans did not know how to stop fighting. The spears broke first. Wooden shafts splintered under the impact of repeated thrusts and parries, cracked when Persian soldiers grabbed them and tried to pull them from Greek hands, shattered when their wielders were knocked down and the spears took the weight of armored bodies. When the spears were gone, the Greeks drew their swords, shorter blades designed for close-quarter stabbing rather than slashing. When those broke or were lost, they fought with their hands, with their shields used as bludgeons, with their teeth if necessary. The sources say they fought with their fists and teeth. This is not poetry. This is what happened when civilized combat devolved into pure animal survival. Leonidas fell early in the fighting. The exact moment is unclear, lost in the chaos of battle. Some sources say he was shot by Persian archers, brought down by the same rain of arrows that had been a constant threat since the first day. Others suggest he fell in hand-to-hand combat, surrounded and overwhelmed. What is certain is that when Leonidas died, something remarkable happened. A battle within the battle, a desperate struggle over his body. In Greek culture, leaving a fallen warrior's body on the battlefield was dishonorable. The dead deserved burial rites, deserved to be returned to their families. So when Leonidas fell, the Spartans surged forward to recover his corpse. The Persians, understanding the symbolic importance of the Spartan king's body, surged forward to take it as a trophy. 4 times the Persians drove toward the body. 4 times the Spartans pushed them back, fighting with a ferocity born of grief and duty. Blood soaked the ground. Men died in heaps around the king's corpse, but the Spartans held, and they dragged Leonidas's body back into their shrinking circle. By this time, the immortals had completed their descent from the mountain and were attacking from the east. The Greeks were truly surrounded now, caught between 2 massive Persian forces. Some sources claim the Greeks retreated to a low hill behind the old wall, making a final stand on higher ground. Others suggest they stayed in place, forming their shield circle wherever they happened to be when the end came. The details matter less than the outcome. They were surrounded, vastly outnumbered, and they knew there would be no escape. The Thebans, according to Herodotus, raised their hands in surrender when they saw the immortals arrive. Some were killed before the Persians understood they were yielding. The survivors were branded with the royal Persian mark, a permanent symbol of their submission. Modern historians debate whether the Thebans truly surrendered or whether this account reflects anti-Theban bias in Herodotus's sources. What we know for certain is that not all Greeks fought to the last, but the Spartans did. The Thespians did. When their spears were gone, and their swords were broken, and their hands were empty, they kept fighting. Herodotus says, "Here they defended themselves to the last, those who still had swords using them, and the others resisting with their hands and teeth." The Persians, unwilling to engage in such savage close-quarters combat, pulled back. They had learned over 3 days that engaging Spartans at arm's length was suicide. So they did what armies do when courage fails. They used overwhelming ranged firepower. Xerxes ordered his archers to surround the hill and loose everything they had. Thousands of arrows filled the air, so many that the story says they blocked out the sun, the origin of the famous Spartan boast that they would fight in the shade. The arrows fell like hail, like a storm of bronze-tipped death. They pierced armor, found gaps in shields, pinned men to the ground. When the surviving Greeks raised their shields to protect against the arrows from one direction, arrows came from another. There was no defense. There was only death. One by one, the Greeks fell. Some died on their feet, bodies held upright by the press of corpses around them. Others fell to their knees and crawled a few more feet before collapsing. A few, wounded but not yet dead, continued to defy the Persians with their final breaths, hurling insults or reaching for dropped weapons. The Persians kept shooting until nothing moved. When the arrows finally stopped falling, and Persian soldiers cautiously approached the hill, they found a scene that would haunt them. Hundreds of Greek bodies lay piled together, surrounded by thousands of Persian corpses. The ground was so soaked with blood, it had turned to mud. Broken spears and shattered shields littered the pass, and in the center of it all, somewhere in that pile of the heroic dead, lay Leonidas, king of Sparta, descendant of Heracles, the man who had chosen death to save his city. Xerxes' reaction was telling. When he toured the battlefield and identified Leonidas's body, he ordered that the king be beheaded and his head mounted on a stake. This was not Persian custom. The Persians typically honored brave enemies, gave them proper burial, treated defeated warriors with respect. But Xerxes made an exception for Leonidas. The order to desecrate the body was a sign of how much the Spartan king had infuriated the great king, how much the 3-day defense had cost in Persian lives and Persian pride. The battle was over. Thermopylae had fallen. The road to southern Greece now lay open. Xerxes could march on Athens, on Sparta, on the Peloponnese. He had won. And yet, in winning, he had lost something he could not regain: the illusion of Persian invincibility. The 3 days at Thermopylae had bought Greece time. Time for the Athenian fleet to prepare. Time for non-combatants to evacuate. Time for the Greek coalition to strengthen its resolve. And most importantly, time for the story to spread. Word of Leonidas and the 300 raced through Greece faster than the Persian army could march. Everywhere the story was told, Greek morale soared. If 300 men could hold off hundreds of thousands for 3 days, if Spartans could choose death over surrender, then perhaps Persia was not unstoppable. Perhaps freedom was worth any price. Perhaps Greece could win. The price of glory. In the immediate aftermath of Thermopylae, Greece teetered on the edge of catastrophe. The pass had fallen. Northern Greece was lost. The Persian army swept southward like a dark tide, and the cities in its path faced impossible choices: submit or burn. Most chose submission. Thebes formally Medized, opening its gates to Xerxes and providing supplies for the Persian army. Boeotia fell without significant resistance. The road to Athens lay open, and there was no army between the Persians and the greatest city in Greece. Athens evacuated. Themistocles, the brilliant but controversial Athenian leader, had prepared for this possibility. The city's population was ferried across to the island of Salamis and to the Peloponnese, leaving Athens nearly empty. When the Persians arrived, they found a ghost city. A small group of defenders had barricaded themselves on the Acropolis, hoping divine protection would save them. The Persians burned them alive, then set fire to the temples. The Parthenon, the sacred heart of Athens, went up in flames. The smoke could be seen for miles, a black pillar marking Athens's destruction. But Athens's people were alive, and so was their fleet. 200 Athenian triremes sat anchored in the Straits of Salamis, joined by ships from other Greek city-states. Themistocles understood what many Greek commanders did not. The war would be decided at sea. The Persian army required naval support for supply lines and communication. Cut off the fleet, and the army would wither. Destroy the Persian navy, and Xerxes would be forced to retreat or risk being trapped in hostile territory with winter approaching. Themistocles faced opposition. Many Greek commanders wanted to withdraw to the Isthmus of Corinth, where they could defend the narrow land bridge to the Peloponnese. Themistocles argued this was suicide. The Persians could simply sail around and land troops behind any defensive line. The only hope was to force a naval battle in the narrow straits of Salamis, where the Persian advantage in numbers would be negated, the same principle that had made Thermopylae defensible for 3 days. To force this battle, Themistocles resorted to deception. He sent a trusted slave to Xerxes with a false message. The Greek fleet was divided and demoralized, planning to escape that very night. If the Persians moved immediately, they could trap and destroy the Greeks before they scattered. Xerxes, still furious over the delay at Thermopylae, took the bait. He ordered his fleet into the straits. The Battle of Salamis in late September 480 BC was one of the most decisive naval engagements in ancient history. In the narrow waters, the Persian fleet could not maneuver or bring its full numbers to bear. The heavier, more maneuverable Greek triremes rammed and sank Persian ships one after another. The battle turned into a slaughter. Persian sailors who jumped into the water drowned because they did not know how to swim. Greek sailors, raised on the sea, had no such disadvantage. By day's end, the Persian fleet was shattered. Xerxes, watching from a throne on the shore, saw his navy, the key to his invasion strategy, destroyed. The loss at Salamis changed everything. Xerxes could no longer maintain his army in Greece through the winter without naval supply lines. He withdrew back to Asia with a large portion of his forces, leaving his general Mardonius with about 100,000 troops to continue the campaign the following year. But the Persian aura of invincibility was broken. Thermopylae had shown that Persians could bleed. Salamis showed they could be beaten. The final act came the following summer. In August 479 BC, a coalition Greek army of over 100,000 hoplites met Mardonius's Persian force at Plataea in Boeotia. The battle was massive, brutal, and decisive. Pausanias, Leonidas's nephew who served as regent for Leonidas's young son, commanded the Spartan contingent. The Greek phalanx, fighting now with vengeance in their hearts, smashed through the Persian lines. Mardonius himself was killed. His army disintegrated. On the same day, or so the story goes, the Greek fleet won another naval victory at Mycale, on the coast of Asia Minor, destroying what remained of the Persian navy. The invasion was over. Xerxes' attempt to conquer Greece had failed utterly. The richest empire on earth had been defeated by a loose coalition of quarrelsome city-states, and it had failed in part because 300 Spartans had bought Greece 3 precious days at Thermopylae. But the price had been high. 1,400 men had died in the pass, most of them Spartans and Thespians. The 300 Spartiates represented a significant portion of Sparta's citizen warrior class. A loss the city could ill afford given its rigid social structure and declining birth rates. Leonidas himself, one of Sparta's 2 kings, was gone. His body had been recovered after the Persian retreat and brought back to Sparta, but the manner of his death, beheaded and desecrated by Xerxes, became a symbol of Persian barbarism and Greek courage. In Sparta, Leonidas was honored as a hero. His son Pleistarchus took the throne under the regency first of Leonidas's brother Cleombrotus and then of Pausanias. Gorgo, Leonidas's widow, remained in Sparta, but history records little of her life after her husband's death. She had decoded the message that warned of Xerxes' invasion. She had sent her husband to die at Thermopylae, knowing he would not return. Her intelligence and courage had been as crucial as any battlefield tactics. Yet, like most women in ancient Greece, she fades from the historical record once her famous men are gone. The Thespians, often forgotten in retellings that focus on the Spartans, were honored too. Theirs was perhaps the purest sacrifice. They were not bound by Spartan lore or culture, were not raised from birth to view death in battle as the highest achievement. They chose to stay simply because it was right, because abandoning allies was dishonorable. Their 700 dead deserved to be remembered alongside the 300 Spartans. But history is written by those with the best publicists, and Sparta's propaganda machine was unmatched. At Thermopylae itself, monuments were erected. One inscription, written by the poet Simonides, became famous. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." The phrasing is significant, obedient to their laws. The Spartans had not died for glory or for personal heroism. They had died because Spartan law demanded they hold their position, never retreat, never surrender. They had followed their programming to its logical conclusion: beautiful death in service to the state. Another monument honored all the Greeks who fought, regardless of city-state. Here 4,000 from the Peloponnese once fought 3 million. The numbers are exaggerated, especially the Persian count, but the sentiment is genuine. This was not just Sparta's stand, it was Greece's stand. A moment when fractious city-states united against a common enemy and proved that freedom was worth dying for. The broader impact of Thermopylae extended far beyond the immediate military outcome. It became a cultural touchstone, a story told to children, a standard of courage against which all other acts of bravery would be measured. It entered the Greek imagination as proof that virtue and discipline could overcome superior numbers, that the worth of a man was measured not by his life's length, but by his willingness to sacrifice it for something greater. The Persians, for their part, never attempted another invasion of mainland Greece. Xerxes returned to Persia and spent the rest of his reign dealing with internal problems, revolts, palace intrigues, the gradual decay of the empire he had inherited. He was assassinated in 465 BC by his own courtiers. The vast empire his father Darius had built began its long, slow decline, ultimately falling to Alexander the Great a century and a half later. Greece, having survived the Persian threat, turned its energies inward. Athens and Sparta, united in the face of external danger, soon became rivals for dominance within Greece. The Peloponnesian War would devastate both cities, proving that Greeks were often their own worst enemies. But that was for the future. For now, in the aftermath of Thermopylae and Salamis and Plataea, Greece was free. And Leonidas had made that freedom possible. Immortal legacy. 2,500 years have passed since that dawn at Thermopylae, when Leonidas and his 300 made their stand. Empires have risen and fallen. Languages have been born and died. The world has transformed in ways that would be incomprehensible to those ancient warriors. Yet the story endures, passed down through generations, retold in every medium from ancient poetry to modern cinema. The names have power still. Leonidas, Thermopylae, Sparta, the 300. Why? Why does this particular defeat, this tactical failure, this massacre of 1,400 men in a remote mountain pass, continue to captivate human imagination? The answer lies not in what happened, but in what it represents. Thermopylae is the story of the few against the many. It is David facing Goliath, the underdog refusing to concede defeat despite impossible odds. Every person who has ever felt outnumbered, outmatched, overwhelmed, can see themselves in those 300 Spartans forming their line at the hot gates. The specifics are ancient, but the emotion is universal and eternal. It is the story of duty versus survival. Leonidas and his men could have retreated. They could have rationalized that living to fight another day was more important than dying in a hopeless last stand. No one would have called them cowards for withdrawing in the face of overwhelming force. But they stayed, because duty demanded it, because their laws demanded it, because their honor demanded it. In an age of moral ambiguity, there is something compelling about absolute commitment. It is the story of free men versus tyranny. The Persians were slaves, fighting because an emperor commanded it. The Greeks were citizens, fighting because they chose to. This distinction mattered to ancient Greeks, and it matters still. Thermopylae became a symbol of democratic freedom standing against autocratic empire, a narrative that Western civilization has repeated in various forms ever since. And it is the story of the beautiful death, the concept the Greeks called kalos thanatos. To die young, in battle, for a worthy cause, surrounded by brothers, having proven one's courage. This was the highest achievement Spartan culture could imagine. Leonidas did not just die. He died perfectly, in a way that would be remembered forever. His death had meaning, had purpose, had impact beyond the immediate military outcome. In a world where most people die forgotten, Leonidas achieved a kind of immortality. The historical record preserved his memory. Herodotus wrote about Thermopylae in his histories, cementing the battle as a central event in the Persian wars. Plutarch discussed Leonidas in his moral essays, using the king as an exemplar of virtue. Diodorus Siculus included detailed accounts in his universal history. These ancient sources, while not always reliable in their specifics, agreed on the broad outline. Leonidas and his men had done something extraordinary. Later generations built on these foundations. The Romans, who conquered Greece but revered Greek culture, admired the Spartans as warriors without peer. Roman officers studied Thermopylae as a tactical example. The Byzantine Empire, which considered itself the continuation of both Roman and Greek civilizations, honored Leonidas as a Christian martyr avant la lettre, a man who had sacrificed himself for others. In the modern era, the battle experienced renewed interest. 18th and 19th century European educators used Thermopylae to teach classical values to aristocratic children. The story fit perfectly with romantic ideals of noble sacrifice and patriotic duty. During the Greek War of Independence in the 1820s, revolutionaries invoked Leonidas and Thermopylae as inspiration for their fight against Ottoman rule. If 300 Spartans could defy an empire, surely modern Greeks could win their freedom. The 20th century saw Thermopylae weaponized for propaganda. Nazi Germany drew parallels between Spartan warriors and German soldiers, conveniently ignoring that the Greeks were fighting for freedom while the Nazis were fighting for conquest. The Allies in World War II also invoked Thermopylae, particularly after British and Commonwealth forces fought a delaying action against German invaders at the same pass in 1941. The location's strategic importance had not diminished in 2.5 millennia. In 1955, Greece erected a bronze statue of Leonidas at Thermopylae. The inscription reads simply, Molon lave, Molon labe. Come and take them. The laconic response Leonidas supposedly gave when Xerxes demanded the Greeks surrender their weapons. The phrase has since been adopted by various groups as a symbol of defiant resistance, sometimes in contexts Leonidas would not recognize or approve. Popular culture has embraced the story enthusiastically. The 1962 film The 300 Spartans presented a relatively historically grounded version of events. Frank Miller's 1998 graphic novel 300 and its 2006 film adaptation took significant creative liberties, transforming history into mythology, but reached audiences who would never have encountered the story otherwise. Suddenly, millions of people who could not locate Sparta on a map knew about Leonidas and Thermopylae. The historical accuracy was questionable, but the emotional core, outnumbered heroes choosing death over dishonor, remained intact. Academic historians have mixed feelings about Thermopylae's popular legacy. Some appreciate the way the story brings ancient history to broad audiences. Others wince at the inaccuracies, the political appropriations, the tendency to glorify militarism and ignore the complexity of ancient warfare and politics. They point out that Thermopylae was a defeat, that it was part of a larger war with many contributing factors, that focusing on one dramatic battle obscures the diplomatic, economic, and naval aspects that actually determined the war's outcome. They are right, of course. History is complex. Thermopylae did not single-handedly save Greece. The Battle of Salamis was arguably more important. The inter-Greek politics that allowed a coalition to form in the first place deserved more credit than any individual battle. Leonidas was not a perfect hero. He was a product of a brutal, militaristic slave society that modern sensibilities should not romanticize. And yet, the story persists, because humans need stories like this. We need to believe that courage matters, that a few determined people can make a difference, that there are principles worth dying for. We need to believe that when faced with impossible odds, the proper response is not surrender, but defiance. These are not historical facts. They are moral truths, or at least moral aspirations, and Thermopylae embodies them in a way few other historical events can match. Today, if you visit the pass at Thermopylae, you will find it much changed. The sea has retreated several kilometers due to sedimentation, turning the narrow coastal pass into a wide plain. The hot springs still bubble up from the ground, giving the place its ancient name, but the terrain bears little resemblance to the battlefield of 480 BC. The modern highway runs through where the Greeks made their stand. Cars and trucks speed past, their drivers perhaps unaware they are crossing ground soaked in ancient blood. But the monuments remain. The statue of Leonidas stands guard, bronze and eternal. The epitaph to the Spartans is carved in stone nearby. Tour guides tell the story to visitors from around the world, and occasionally, quietly, soldiers from modern militaries visit to pay their respects. They understand what those ancient warriors understood, that some positions must be held, regardless of the cost, that duty sometimes demands the ultimate sacrifice, that how you die can be as important as how you live. Leonidas died 2,500 years ago, but he has not been forgotten. His name is still spoken, his courage is still honored, and his choice, to stand when he could have run, to die when he could have lived, to place duty above survival, still challenges us to ask what we would do in his place. Most of us will never face such a choice. We will not be called to stand at a mountain pass against an invading army, but we will face our own smaller Thermopylaes, moments when doing the right thing will cost us dearly, when convenience and self-interest pull one direction, while principle pulls another. In those moments, we might remember a king who could have fled, but chose to fight, who could have saved himself, but chose to save his city. We might remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. We might remember 300 warriors at dawn, shields locked together, facing an empire. And we might find, in that ancient story, the strength to make our own stand. The legends never die. They live in every person who refuses to bend when the world demands submission, who stands when standing seems impossible, who fights when fighting seems futile. They live in the defiant no spoken to tyranny, in the courage to face overwhelming odds, in the willingness to sacrifice everything for a cause greater than oneself. This was not just history. This was a message sent across centuries, carved in blood and bronze. Freedom has a price, and some debts can only be paid with life itself. Leonidas paid that price willingly, surrounded by brothers, facing an empire, never surrendering, never breaking. If this story moved you, honor that courage. Like, subscribe, and stand with us. Because legends never die. They wait in the hearts of all who refuse to kneel, ready to be born again, in every generation that chooses defiance over submission, because the next legend is already waiting to be told.